Welcome back to China in the News. We are discussing the ripple effects of U.S. China tariffs on global trade and economies. On Monday, May 12th, U.S. and China officials struck a deal to roll back tariffs and agree to a 90-day truce in their trade war. The U.S. will lower its tariffs on Chinese goods from 145% to 30%, while China will cut its rate on U.S. goods to 10%. Join me as always is Professor Doug Guthrie, China scholar and global management expert. Doug, thanks for being here.
Christine, thanks for having me. I mean, it's always so great to talk to you about these important issues, and we're at such a critical time in the U.S. economy and the U.S. China relations world and the geopolitical economy. And so I'm so happy to be here to talk to you about these issues.
Thank you. In 2024, China was still the U.S. third largest trading partner after Mexico and Canada, with a trade deficit of 295 billion, about 1% of U.S. economy. Despite this, we've seen a dramatic shift in trade flows, especially since the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. Chinese exports, once bound for the U.S., are now finding their way to Southeast Asia, Latin America, and even Africa. How do you interpret this shift?
So, I mean, I love the question, Christine, and I think it's a really important thing for followers to really think deeply about. When we think about flows of trade and flows of goods, and we rank who's our biggest trading partner, um, you know, for about 30 years, China grew to be the United States' largest trading partner after Deng Xiaoping opened China up and after we started investing in China and things were pretty solid for a long time. And then in 2018, with Trump's first uh, launch of tariffs, suddenly China dropped off as our largest trading partner, and then Mexico became our largest trading partner. But we know a lot of the goods were flowing from China to Mexico and then Mexico to the United States. And so I just think the issue of like who's the largest trading partner is always a little bit of a strange question because you know, goods are still flowing from China to the United States. And so, to your specific question, also, I mean, in addition to Mexico, a lot of the goods have been flowing to other places like Vietnam and India and other partners in Asia that are then shipping those goods to the United States. And so China is still a critical trading partner for the United States, hands down. I mean, so much of U.S. goods are produced in China, and those goods flow back into the United States. And so it's China, our relationship with China as a trading partner is still critical.
Got it. Well, I want to show you this TikTok video. It cracks me up. It really shows a trading balance between the US and China. Our homes in the US are overflowing with stuff that says made in China. But over in China, they're pretty self-sufficient. You hardly see anything with made in US over there. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Hello from China. Let me show you the United States products in my home. Nothing. Do you have something from China in your home?
Yeah, well, thank you. The video I think is remarkable and great, but I mean, I think that one of the key things is that um, yes, uh, China makes much of what we have in the United States in our homes, and but let's not forget that the China built the manufacturing supply chain after Apple and hundreds of other corporations wrote the blueprint, patented the design, shipped the know-how over to China. And so China's manufacturing prowess, which then surpassed uh, the everybody else in the world, it's been built on 40 years of innovation between the United States and China. And so it's just a little bit of an interesting thing. I mean, you raised the question of like, okay, well, we have things that say made in China, um, and Chinese households have little that says made in the United States, but we're all making stuff together. I mean, it's a very, very complicated dynamic, and we're partners. We've been building this global manufacturing supply chain together for the last 46 years. And so
Well, like the iPhone, it says designed in Cupertino, made in China, right?
well, you know my the story of that for me is I think a really great one and a remarkable one. When you and I were both working at Apple, um, it became very clear to me that in China and sort of helping Apple understand U.S. China relations and understand their role in China, this was very offensive to the Chinese because the idea that Apple couldn't say made in China, they had to say designed by Apple in Cupertino and manufactured in China, um, was a problem because actually the phones were made in China. I mean, yes, engineers and brilliant people designed the product in Cupertino, but the phones were made in China. And so there was a moment that we got the shift where Apple dropped the byline saying designed by Apple in Cupertino and manufactured in China, and phones just started saying made in China. And but there was I think I've told you this story, but there was a funny moment when I was trying to walk through this and figure out what was happening. And I kept seeing phones that said that same thing, but they were all, um, you know, they were all the phones that weren't actually Apple phones, but they were the the phones that were fake. And the phones that were fake were all saying designed by Apple in Cupertino, made in China. And I went to ask somebody who was in that economy, and he said, "Well, we know that Apple's a very arrogant company, and we think our Chinese buyers won't believe that these are Apple phones unless they say designed by Apple in Cupertino, manufactured
That's
in China."
that's hilarious.
Yeah, it's a fun moment. It's a fun moment in China.
Well, we talked about the trade. Let's use there's a pass-through example is the solar panel industry. Tariff on Chinese solar panel led to assembly operations moving to Southeast Asia. So finished products were then re-imported into US, effectively sidestepping the tariffs. This illustrates how interconnected global supply chains are. And US trade officials levy steep tariffs on most solar cells from Southeast Asia, a key step toward wrapping up the lawsuit with which American manufacturer accused Chinese companies of flooding the market with unfair cheap goods. So, Doug, can you kind of break this down and analyze this?
Well, I mean, it's a great question and a great topic. It's a really important one, and we all remember when, leaders like Gino Raimondo and others went over to China and like accused China of dumping. But global supply chains are incredibly complex. And so even when goods appear to bypass tariffs and the raw materials or components are, you know, they often still originate in China. And so this highlights the resilience of Chinese manufacturers, but also the challenges of trying to decouple from China in today's economy. And so we see this very close interaction and reliance. And the one thing that you and I have talked about often, and this is a part of my my life's work, is really understanding how China is such a powerful capitalist economy right now, is that they are building and manufacturing things at such a high rate, but also at better costs and better cost structures. And so when it looks like they're quote unquote dumping onto the market, what they're actually doing is just subsidizing manufacturing, which we should be doing too, by the way. And so it's just, I think it's a really complex dynamic. And solar panels are a great example of this because just like iPhones are important, so are solar panels and solar energy. And so it's a really,
Wait, who's providing the subsidy at the provincial level or the government, like a national government level? Can
It's
you talk a
all
little bit about the subsidy?
sure, and it's a great question. So I think we often mistakenly think of, we think of planned economies or communist planned economies that are all subsidized from the central government, like Moscow or Beijing. And the real innovation of China is that Beijing isn't subsidizing anything. What Beijing has done is it's created a very decentralized system. You will recall in previous conversations we've talked about Andy Walter's brilliant article in 1995 called Local Governments as Industrial Firms. And what Beijing has done is it's created the incentives for provinces, but more important, municipalities, um, first tier, second tier, third tier cities to really think innovatively about how they develop their economies. And so the subsidies don't come from Beijing. The subsidies all come from provinces, municipalities, first tier, second tier, and third tier cities. And so they're just a very, very aggressive in creating the subsidies for building a strong manufacturing economy. And so then when China is able to produce solar panels or iPhones at much cheaper rates than anywhere else in the world would be, they get accused of dumping. But what's really happening is that they've just created a very healthy manufacturing economy.
But do these subsidies continue, or is it just to get the industry started?
I mean, it, there's a continuum and a spectrum here. And for the most part, it's to get the industry started and kicked off. But, this is, again, when we think about how this economy runs and we hear questions about like, will China hit its 5.1% GDP growth rate projections for 2025? The government is very aggressive at putting its thumb on the scale of how to ensure that its local manufacturers are able to produce for the world. And so, again, when we frame this as dumping, or subsidizing industries that encourage dumping, I just think it's a little bit of a simplistic way of talking about it because what's really happening is that you're just getting a healthy interaction between the state, and we're talking about the local state, and the manufacturing economy that produces goods for the global capitalist economy.
Got it. Well, let's talk about some challenges. We talked about the global impact. Um, Tariffs have really slowed down global economic growth, disrupted supply chains, and increased uncertainty for business worldwide. Can you talk more about kind of the ramification globally, even though we're talking about U.S. China tariffs, trade
Yeah,
war between the two?
yeah. And I mean, you and I have talked about this before, and so I'll just speak briefly about this. I think the narrative and the way we're talking about tariffs in this country is ridiculous. We're basically saying we'll increase tariffs so that we'll then manufacture these goods in America. And, the logic of tariffs is that you raise prices at the border such that if manufacturing costs, because of higher labor costs, are more expensive in your own country, like your home country, like the United States, then we'll buy American because prices will be equal. But that presupposes that you have the manufacturing supply chain in America, and we don't. And so, to me, it's just sort of a ridiculous narrative because you have people like President Trump and Peter Navaro talking about this idea of raising tariffs against the evil Chinese empire. And we don't have the manufacturing supply chains built here, and it will take us 20, 30, 40 years to build that manufacturing supply chain, and it will be more expensive. Now, if it was here, then we could actually raise tariffs and thus raise prices at the border and then buy American, but we don't have those manufacturing supply chains. And so I just, I think it's an absurd argument right now. And the really sad thing, Christine, is I think they're banking on the idea that most citizens of this country don't understand. They don't know the complexity of manufacturing supply chains and tariffs and raising prices, and so then it just is a trade war of words because we're talking about raising tariffs and having products like solar panels or iPhones go up in price with the assumption that we'll build those things in America, which we can't. And so, I just think that we'd be much better off to kind of live in a global political economy where we think broadly about partnership and continue to build the partnerships that we've built over the last 40 plus years. So that's sort of my view on that.
We talked about the pass-through case where tariffs really were levied on the third-party countries like Vietnam. So let's talk about actually one beneficiary of the trade war. So the commodities markets. Retaliatory tariffs from China have really reshaped agriculture trade, with Brazil emerging as a big winner for soybeans. You'll know that imports, U.S. export to China of soybean has declined while Brazilian export to China has increased significantly. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and again, this is a great point and a great question because when we think about tariffs, we think about things like iPhones and maybe solar panels, but like, you know, probably the group that has been hurt the most by the 2018 tariffs going forward has been U.S. farmers and U.S. agricultural markets. I mean, China is has been, and will continue to be a huge consumer of things like soybeans. And it used to be the case that the United States was a major exporter of soybeans to China. And then when the 2018 tariffs hit and we started to see um, just trade war stuff emerging, we saw the U.S. soybean exports to China just decline dramatically. And, we've seen um, China's use of soybeans continue to grow, but Brazil has replaced the United States as the major exporter of soybeans to China. And and so, it's a very interesting moment when we think about this because it's just this hurts U.S. farmers and U.S. agricultural system because one of their major purchasers of their product is now moving elsewhere. There's one other thing that's interesting for what you and I have talked about before, but this is the trade war starting with the initial Trump tariffs in 2017-18 has also reinvigorated the BRICS coalition, right? And so, if China's thinking about like, well, okay, so the United States is our largest trading partner, maybe we should pivot away from that. Who else can we rely on? Well, there's this thing called BRICS, Brazil,
And
Russia.
B is BRICS. Oh, well, B is Brazil.
Yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa in the original formation. And you're right, B is Brazil, right? And so was the moment when BRICS was reinvigorated and Brazil became the major exporter of soybeans to China. And so yeah, it's a hard moment for U.S. agriculture and I think bad for the U.S. economy.
Well, I'm Chinese, so I just want to share. In China, soybeans are actually used to produce a wide range of food products. So you've heard of soy sauce, tofu, and then cooking oil. So anyway, so that's why Chinese people use a lot more soybeans than the rest of the world.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Thank you.
So, we're navigating uncertainty in this world, all of this contributing to global economic breakdown. How should companies navigate this climate?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, Christine, and I don't have a simple answer except to say that, whether you're a massive company like Apple or smaller companies that are dealing with manufacturing supply chains in a variety of different segments, I mean, we always talk about Apple, but I often also say Walmart is the single largest exporter from China to the United States, and this is mostly light industry goods and garments and toys and my view is we're all married to China. Like this is not gonna it just can't be as simple as raising tariffs and so suddenly then all manufacturing will come back to the United States and will create jobs. And I mean, it's going to be a very complicated market. And so my answer, Christine, is that I think companies just need to be very thoughtful, aggressive in terms of their lobbying of the United States government and their dealing with the U.S. geopolitical issues, but also just very thoughtful and diplomatic in how they're operating in China. And you and I saw this. I mean, you and I have talked a lot about Patrick McGee's new book that's coming out on Apple and China. And it was a very interesting and powerful process in which Apple navigated the trade wars and navigated the tensions in U.S. China relations from 2013 to today. And, I think companies that do that in a smart and intelligent way are going to fare well. I think you know, I'm nervous and sad about what's happening between U.S. China relations because I think some of these things become culturally embedded and they can be damaging for long term and don't just change with a new administration. But I think the companies that are going to survive well are the ones that are going to think very carefully about diplomacy, not just in terms of lobbying in the United States, but also their their status with being diplomatic citizens. I mean, under Xi Jinping, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, but like the whole concept of in China for China and helping China to continue to navigate and grow, um, I think it's in everybody's interests. China's the second largest economy in the world, and I think you and I have discussed. I've been predicting that China is going to be the largest economy in the world in 6 years, and we need to be with China. Like we just have to continue to be healthy diplomatically, and so I think that's the best that companies can do is just be present and ignore the politics of Washington. And the one other thing that I think you and I have talked about a lot is moving beyond Beijing, Washington dynamics and really thinking about second and third tier cities and sister city relationships and kind of developing local political economies. I think that's really the future.
That's awesome. So, for our audience, we are currently recording. Today is May 13th. The Apple in China book launched today, in which Professor Doug Guthrie was the main character in chapter 28 as the China Whisperer. So, before we wrap up, Doug, um, we're seeing some improvements with U.S. China talks. Well, this is actually the tariff trade war that President Trump actually started. Do you think our trade relations can ever recover from this chaotic past 3, 4 months?
Well, Christine, I hope so. And again, I think there are a lot of strange politics that are going on in the United States right now where people like Donald Trump and Peter Navarro are trying to sort of make their name and stake their claim on the positioning of these issues. But the global political economy is important and it's much more complicated than the egos of a few political figures. And so again, I believe if we continue to think about diplomatic relations between major corporations like Apple, I mean, I think Tim Cook has been an amazing diplomat. He's gone to China many times over the years that I've been watching Apple closely and has been a part of those relationships, but so have many other players. And some of them are unknown players. My old friend Dan Wright, who was the founder of the Greenpoint Group, has been an amazing person who's been not just an organizational and economic consultant, but a diplomat. And so I just think that the more we continue to push diplomacy, and it's all in our own, each country's and people's economic interests. Like we have to continue to be intertwined because the world is a complex global political economy. And so, I hope my hope is that we'll continue to do that work. And I think that you and I are continuing to push that work. Like that's what we really believe in is helping the world have a complex understanding of the interconnected nature of the global political economy. And so that's
You
our job.
talk a lot about Peter Navarro, who is Donald Trump's um, advisor on trade. His official title is let me look it up. His official title. Well, he is a counselor, but his official title is Senior Counselor to the President for Trade and Manufacturing. Um, why? I also read that he might have been sanctioned by China. So tell me about Peter Navarro. You're not a fan.
I'm not a fan. And you know, we all make decisions in our careers and do articles and write books and speak about things that we believe and think are important. And so I don't want to be, aggressively say things like he's disingenuous or opportunistic. But, he wrote a book called Death by China. And, the book with his co-author Greg Autry is, um, you know, it's a very, very aggressive anti-China book. And basically it stakes out a position that says that, you know, China, communist China, is growing in its power, and it's taking over the world, and basically controlling trade and controlling economic growth in the world. And you know, I, I think it is true that China has been on a very aggressive growth trajectory since Deng Xiaoping came and visited Jimmy Carter in 1979. But it's been a growth trajectory that has benefited the world. And the United States has benefited tremendously. I mean, the book that you and I were just mentioning by Patrick McGee, Apple in China, I mean, you know, Apple has become the most profitable company in the world in part because of China. It's not just about like the engineers in Cupertino who have designed beautiful products. It's about Tim Cook and his brilliance about taking Apple manufacturing abroad and entering China in 2001 after China entered the WTO. And so we live in a very complex geopolitical world. And so I just don't, I'm a little nervous and skeptical and distrustful of books that are and articles that are written that just say, China is the evil force here and they're trying to kill us, which is what death by China implies. Um, and I think we're all in this. And so I think good diplomacy and good geopolitical collaboration and cooperation is the way forward. And so yeah, so it's just a little bit strange to me that Peter Navarro has such a high level advisory position in the U.S. government because I just think his if you put sort of a spectrum of people who are pro-China, like Doug Guthrie, and people who are completely anti-China, like Peter Navarro, I think what we need is sort of a balanced middle ground. And so it's just a little shocking to me that he has such a high voice of influence.
Well, White House, Professor Guthrie is still waiting for your call. Um, Thank you for breaking down all these complex issues. And thanks to our audience for joining us. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time on China in the News. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, Christine. It's so good to talk to you as always. Bye bye.